All right. So thank you again for joining us tonight. I want to thank our lecture series sponsor, Marble Harbor Investment Council, who makes this and all of our public programming possible throughout the year. We're very grateful for their continued support for many years now. And we're thrilled to welcome virtually Sarah Rose from Hawaii. Thank you for joining us all the way from Hawaii. Sarah is a journalist. She's an author. She's a graduate of Harvard College and the University of Chicago. She was a columnist for the Wall Street Journal, and her articles have also appeared in the New York Post, Travel and Leisure, Bon Appetit, and the Saturday Evening Post. And as well as the book she's going to talk about tonight, she has another one called D-Day Girls, the Spies Who Armed the Resistance, Sabotaged the Nazis, and Helped Win World War II. So Sarah, welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you guys so much for having me. So I hope you'll bear with me if there are technical difficulties. I'm also new to this. I'm going to talk to you about the greatest act of spying in the history of the world. And that is the moment that Great Britain stole tea from China. Every time you have a cup of tea, you are drinking something that was once protected and has since been stolen. So hopefully this all works. Oh no, and it doesn't immediately. Forgive me. All right.
Do you ever use your arrows? Sometimes those work too.
The arrows.
On your computer or your laptop?
Not working at all.
Not working at all. Oh no, well maybe, I know it's a pain, but can we go back to your list and just go one by one that way?
Sure, absolutely. I guess this seems to be our option.
I'm sorry.
No, it's as much my fault for, we saw that we could get the screen up, but then we didn't realize we couldn't actually play this.
True, strange.
All right, well, here we go. Let's get back to number one. Okay, let me just try this one more time and see if maybe it's okay. So this is the greatest act of corporate espionage in the history of the world. And I defy anyone to make the claim that something was bigger. Because tea, when it was stolen, was worth about 5% of British economy, the entire Great British economy, the entire colonial economy. Tea imports and the taxes on them paid for roads and hospitals and civil servant salaries and an awful lot of the infrastructure that it came into being during the Industrial Revolution was paid for with money importing tea, processed tea from China to Great Britain. So I'm going to talk about what makes something corporate espionage and why this was so important to the globe, as well as to the Empire of Great Britain. And okay, now we've got it working. The first place to start is to define our terms. So what is industrial espionage? It's kind of a new concept. Something has to be valuable. And I mean new as of the 19th century. Something had to be valuable. It had to have a unique formula or recipe. You're not stealing secrets if everybody has it, right? It also has to be protected. And this comes up a lot in the modern world. There are lots of things that are valuable and have a unique recipe that anybody can access. But key part of espionage is someone doesn't want you to access it and they're putting energy into making sure you can't. It also gives whoever has it a competitive advantage, right? Intellectual property, it is patents, it says that because I came up with this, I deserve to profit off of it and not everybody else. Let's go start with valuable. How valuable is tea? Okay, so how much was all the tea in China worth? Tea was 100% of exports from the Empire of China and worth 5% of the British economy, as well as 10% of the tax revenues. And we've just learned that if you take 5% of an economy away, it is a crash, right? It is more than a recession. We are looking at depression level economic contraction if tea were to go away. And in the 19th century, that was a threat, which we'll get to. What is the unique formula about tea? Well, we have here a picture, a 19th century diagram of a tea plant. Tea isn't a pick and eat fruit. The way you get tea is by just using the top 2 leaves and a bud of the tea plant. The vast majority of the tea bush, it's a camellia, is not useful at all for drinking. It's too tannic, it's too rough, you don't want any part of it. But the very top 2 leaves, the bits of sprouts that tea is pushing out to grow, is where the tender kind of nectar of tea is. And so it is a camellia, it's a flower, and it doesn't travel very well. In the 19th century, plants were very hard to move from place to place. If you're the British Empire and you were commanding a globe, you wanted to get a rose from, say, England to a garden in India, odds are pretty good it wouldn't work. You are putting it on a boat full of sea spray, shipping it around the Horn of Africa and over to India. There's not a Suez Canal yet. It's a months-long journey, at least 3 months. Odds are pretty good that plant doesn't make it. And tea, this one little flower, was worth 10% of the British economy, right? Because not only, I mean, everyone was addicted to it. And it wasn't just that they loved the taste of it. In a rapidly industrializing economy, like the 19th century, when you are going from your agrarian world to your factories and manufacturing, tea was incredibly useful for delivering calories to a workforce. Britain by the 19th century has completely expanded past its ability to feed itself as an island, right? It's had this Malthusian dilemma. It really can't make enough food to feed the growing population. And on top of that, with industrialization, you get cities, and cities are crowded and they're full of germs, as we are learning. Tea requires you to boil water. Hearing someone else, sorry. And so tea is valuable to your economy as a commodity, but also for the effects it produces. Here we see, these are tea seeds. These are like, they're very, very fragile. They rot almost immediately. And they don't, and so that when you grow tea in China, it's pretty much stuck in China. There was no way to move this economy anywhere other than China. There we have, these are the 2 leaves in the bud. So this is a branch from a tea plant, and this is the bit, it's got to be picked by hand, that goes into your tea bags. You can seed tea, you can transplant plants in 2 different ways, right? There's the seed, which we all know. You can also do clones. And so this is somebody who's cutting off a clone, where you will take a cutting of a plant, plant that, it will then produce roots, and you get a daughter plant that is the exact genetic replica. Even this, you couldn't get it around the Horn of Africa. You just couldn't move plants very easily. But it's not just that it's this bush and it's this flower, it's highly processed. A thing to know about tea is it's not a pick and eat fruit, right? It's not an apple. It's a lot more analogous to wine. It requires a lot of processes. It has a secret. It requires a lot of expertise. It requires certain growing conditions, certain equipment, a formula, a recipe. And it produces very different kinds of tea. So you can get something over here, your green tea, all the way here to your dark black oolongs. These are all things that happen in the processing of tea. So I'm making the case that when you're stealing tea, you're not just stealing the plant, and you're not just stealing your seeds, and you're not even just stealing daughter plants. What you are stealing is the way to get all of this into the cup. I like to sort of liken it to the difference between a roast potato and a baked potato. Your darker teas are going to be your roast potato, and you get all that lovely caramelization and those sort of more complex flavors. And your green teas are a little more like a boiled potato, where it's a potato in its edible form. And actually key to the potato, there's a bit of a side story, is that a potato enough alone wouldn't be valuable or a secret. And yet somebody can claim possession for having brought the potato to the New World, and that's Christopher Columbus. Like, there was a moment that plants were introduced, where the potato itself became available to the West. And that's one of those key parts, the invention of something. So, mission. We have here something that doesn't seem to be working. Okay. The mission is, how do you do industrial espionage? One, you're going to have to get tea. You're going to have to get those seeds. You're going to have to get those daughter plants. And step 3, you're going to make a lot of money. But the step 2, the middle bit, how do you get these plants from China anywhere else in the world? China in the 19th century is a completely closed system, okay? No Westerner has been allowed in or out since Marco Polo. So for about 300 years, no one stepped foot into China. And British East India Company would like to get tea out of China and bring it to India. So let's talk about these two sides. This is the Empire of China in the 19th century. And this is in between Opium Wars, in which Westerners were only allowed in 4 ports on the Chinese coast. They weren't allowed in the interior, right? It's completely closed. The vast majority of Western contact with China at this point is here in the port of Canton, which is just up the Pearl River from what is today Hong Kong. And the other empire we're going to talk about is the Empire of Great Britain. And this is at the sort of height of the Victorian Empire. This is the moment when 1/3 of the world is pink. It is, the sun never sets, quite literally. There is never a moment on a single day where there is not daylight in the British Empire. And these are all the colonial possessions at the moment where tea is so critical to the British economy. It really just makes the world go round. The entire colonial universe is funded in a very large part on a drink. So let's talk about how protected it is. No foreigners allowed in, not since Marco Polo. They fought 2 wars, right? Can you make an argument that something's protected if an entire nation is willing to go to war over it? The answer is yes. Like, they were willing to die for tea. It was also illegal for Chinese people to leave China, including the tea makers. Chinese people in the 19th century were considered the possession, of the empire, the emperor. If you left, you were stealing from the emperor himself. So the Chinese were going to extreme lengths to protect this plant, this flower. Now, can tea be property? This is the harder claim to make. Where do plants come from? In the 19th century, there was this idea that plants came from God, right? They are here for us, mankind, to use with our superior intelligence for our own ends. How can any person claim that a plant can be property? Well, if you're the person who introduces a plant to a new place, you may have a claim, like Christopher Columbus and the potato. But in Massachusetts in 1848, at this very moment, we get a new idea, a new under the face of the sun. It is the idea of intellectual property. A judge in Massachusetts says that we can protect intellectual property, the labors of the mind, productions and interests as much as man's own, as the wheat he cultivates or the flocks he rears. It is the first moment we see a connection between human intellectual endeavor and profit itself. And that legal notion is now fully established, but it was brand new in Massachusetts in 1848. The first idea of the legal concept of intellectual property, that you can own an idea and that ideas are profitable. So these 2 empires are not just political units, they are effectively drug cartels. We have here Queen Victoria, and this is her coronation picture when she becomes Empress of India, which for our purpose, she's not quite Empress of India yet. And here we have the Qianlong Emperor, who predates this by about 100 years, but he wears the yellow robe of the emperor. You may recognize this if you've seen the movie The Last Emperor. They are in possession of vast amounts of space, they are in control of vast amounts of people, and they are both drug pushers. They are, in fact, some of the most powerful drug pushers who have ever lived. we've talked about how the British Empire really depends on tea. What we haven't talked about is the relationship to getting tea. The Chinese were happy to sell tea to Britain, and the Qianlong Emperor, this one in particular, was madly in love with clocks. He was perfectly happy to take all British money and buy very expensive, very elaborate clocks. But there was nothing that China wanted from Britain. There was no real trade you could have because China was fully self-sufficient. They had silk. Why would they want British cotton? They had Chinese porcelain. Why would they want British stoneware? They looked at the West as an inferior producer, and they had a good claim to that. And there was no commodity like tea that they wanted to buy. So you get what is called a balance of payments problem. British Empire has to pay silver for the commodity of tea. Money flows one way, and products flow the other, and that is swiftly emptying the coffers of the Bank of England. A solution comes in the form of another flower, and this is the poppy, the opium poppy. So tea, as we've mentioned, is a camellia. Opium comes from the opium poppy. You slit open the bud, and there is a sap that drains out of it, and it is analgesic, makes you a little bit high, it's super fun. And the British Empire, and it grows natively in what is now Afghanistan, which at that point was part of British India. And it was something you could trade for tea, but you had to create a market for it. You had to get people hooked. So now you've got the British Empire financially dependent on tea and emotionally dependent on tea, and now physically dependent on tea. Tea is a stimulant as well. It's not as physically addictive, not remotely physically addictive as opium, but it is very much a part of their daily life. But opium creates a physical addiction. So we have these two drugs, caffeine and opioids, that are now trading each other. The Chinese don't like it. The Chinese hate the fact of tea being flooding into their economy. It creates a nation of addicts. It makes people unproductive. It's an illness. We in America right now, of course, can see the costs of opium addiction in our own society. But effectively, you have two monopolies. And monopolies in general in the Western world, we're not fans. They're bad. They're bad for a couple of reasons. They inflate prices artificially because they can. You don't have any competition. There is no market that you are not in control of. They stifle innovation. As long as you're a monopoly, you can make sure that no one else has a piece of that market. And this is where we get to the point about competitive advantage in espionage. These are two monopolies that are maintaining their competitive advantage, and British Empire wants to take the Chinese advantage on tea away. They're fighting wars. They don't like the way China is putting up the prices. The Chinese are doctoring tea. They're putting chemicals in it, some of which are poison. And there's all this profit too. Why wouldn't they want to steal something that, if they controlled it, they would get all of the money, not just some bit along the way as they're passing it from China to England. So here I'm going to have to talk about the very first joint stock corporation. The British Empire is not sending its own soldiers or its own ships to do this. It has outsourced the work to the world's first joint stock company, the East India Company. It was a huge change in the history of mercantile and economics to have a company like this. So this is, just to give you a sense, this is the East India House, which is no longer there in the 1700s. It was chartered in 1600 by Queen Elizabeth, and it is a joint stock company, which means that it's also the first time you get a managerial class, where ordinarily businesses up until this moment, if you were the butcher, you owned the butcher shop and you were managing the butcher shop. You were you were the only stockholder, you were also the only person in control of running it. With the East India Company, you had shareholders, and then you had this managerial class who managed your inventory, who did your trades, who did your banking, who were remote from the product itself. And it produced an awful lot of intellectual change, just this fact, in Britain. And there were a number of really famous East India Company alumni, including Adam Smith, who we've all heard of, right? He is the man who has given us what is our sort of foundational knowledge about markets. But also a little known New England settler named Elihu Yale made his fortune in the East India Company and founded a university that is not nearly as good as the universities in Massachusetts. It had a global reach. From the seat in London, its furthest most outpost, this is the first global company, the very first global company, and it does the colonial work of the British Empire. In particular, it is the de facto government of the subcontinent of India. It has the ability to mint money, it can raise an army, it can write laws, and it has a managerial class that it sends out to these colonies to run them as rulers. It is also failing by the 19th century. With the ideas of Adam Smith, the notion that monopolies are bad, the fact that the East India Company is now huge and bloated and not, you get smaller companies who want a piece of the Far East trade, who want a slice of it. And so its dominance is getting chipped away now that it's been in existence for 250 years. It has this idea that if it could steal tea from China and bring it to India, its last remaining possession, it might save the company, it might spare the shareholders bankruptcy. So here we are again. I want to talk just a little bit about the physical distance we're talking about. Here is the global map of the British Empire. Here, let's see, right down here about, looks like is Hong Kong. This is the subcontinent of India. We've got Pakistan and Afghanistan over here. This is South India. Here, small island off the coast of Europe, is London, the seat of colonial power. And to get from the seat of colonial power to the furthest most outpost, you have to sail all the way around. You have a bunch of co-link stops. Sort of here, you've got St. Helena and South Africa, island of Mauritius over here, coal again along the coast, crossing the Indian Ocean, and then up here all the way to China. 3-month trip. 3-month trip funded by tea with enormous profits attached to it. A little bit about India. This is what the colonial empire looked like at the time. And here is Afghanistan. Here is where the poppies are coming from. This is the only part of India that's profitable, is the opium trade. Britain thought it'd be wonderful to have a couple 100 million people working for them who you could call upon to have as soldiers, and that there would be all these products in India, like cotton, that you could then sell abroad as a refined good. But mostly, India was difficult to manage, very expensive. There were lots of wars. It didn't pay its way. The one thing a colony needs to do is pay for itself. Otherwise, all that profit in the Bank of England, all that money in London is going the wrong direction. So it was as large as the USA is now, about territory-wise. It had 300 million people, which is almost about what we have right now. So it's an entire US controlled from London, but by this joint stock company that is raising armies, taxes, and laws, draining money from the company itself. And it's not a very successful venture for the East India Company, but they can save it. They can save it if they can steal a protected piece of property. So they need somebody to do this. Who can go to China, a place that's been totally closed for 200 years at least, go in, not speaking the language, get tea and then move it to another country successfully at a time when plants don't travel well. Who's qualified to do that? The man they chose was named Robert Fortune. Fortune was Scottish, and he was in this very elite group of scientists, most of whom were self-funded, like Charles Darwin, married to the Wedgwood fortune. He could travel the world on ships and do his discoveries because his wife's family paid for it. Robert Fortune didn't have those advantages. The British Empire was useful for England in particular because it gave people who didn't have their own money a way of rising up in an otherwise pretty solid social world. Fortune is Scottish. The Scots have a better education system than Britain at the time. They have parish schooling, and their universities are pretty exquisite. You always see Scotty on Star Trek, right? He's the engineer. They have a reputation for being good doctors and good engineers. And Fortune came up through apprenticeships to be one of the leading botanists of his day, and probably the lead botanist who did not have money to send himself to medical school. So he's risen very far in British society and in the plant world. He's risen as far as he can go. He is in charge of the Chelsea Physic Garden in London. And if you are in London, when it is possible for us to travel again, I highly recommend you go. It is one of the most delightful surprises in London. It is a tiny little garden on the banks of the Thames that was used for physics, which at the time meant medicine. It is where you grew medicinal plants. It's where you studied planting. And he was in charge. It's sort of an outgrowth of Kew Gardens, but specifically for the study of how plants can become medicine. And our plants are medicine. Most of, up until this sort of modern moment of molecular biology, we depended on plants like the cinchona bark to make quinine, which would help prevent malaria. Aspirin comes from a plant. You can look at medicine like opium, another plant. So they're the research and development men of the empire. When they are finding plants elsewhere, they are finding ways to make money. It's like Xerox PARC, but for the 19th century. So does Fortune count as a spy? He is being hired to go to another country. I think under both definitions, noun and verb, what he did was spying. He was a person who secretly collects and reports information on the activities, movements, and plans of an enemy and competitor. China and England are fighting wars against each other. They're edging each other out for profits. They are certainly enemies and certainly competitors. Works for a government or other organization by secretly collecting information about the enemies and collectors. Fortune was sent to China to do both of these things. He went undercover. So this is an interesting part of the story, and this is actually the bit that got me into For All the Tea in China in the first place. Fortune went undercover to a place where no Westerner had been in the interior for several hundred years, and no one thought that this Westerner wasn't Chinese. How is that possible? Well, China was so closed. It was basically an epistemic system all to itself. So it didn't really know what Westerners looked like. It didn't have an image of what a white guy looked like. Also, at the time, the Manchurian court are foreigners. So China itself is being run by a foreign power. And that is known in all the provinces, that China is not like, it's more like the federated colonies of the US at this point, rather than one nation that sees itself entirely as one people. It doesn't have one language. It has several different regional dialects. So if you're Chinese, you think, well, I've never seen a white guy. I don't know that he's white. Also, I know that we're run by foreigners. So though he doesn't look like me, he could just be the foreigner who runs me. That helped. He was working for one side against the other. There was no question where his sympathies lie. He was not an impartial observer. He was there on behalf of the East India Company. And he knew the value. So Fortune was the very first person into China since Marco Polo, but this was his second trip. The very first trip he took was immediately after the end of the Opium Wars, when the Royal Geographic Society, which is the sort of credentialing body for biologists in Britain at the time, hires him from the Physic Garden to go to China to collect valuable plants. In the industrial era, as people are moving out of the countryside and into cities, Britain has a kind of plant obsession. Orchids start to be worth entire fortunes. 35,000 pounds for an orchid in those days, which is many millions upon millions for an orchid today. He was sent to get exotic flowers, many of which we now have in our gardens today. One of the very first, most cheerful visions of spring is the forsythia. Robert Fortune brought that from China to us. Most of our garden plants, in fact, start in the kind of rich, biodiverse regions of China. The kumquat, Citrus fortunae, he named for himself. It is the fortune citrus, also one of the things he brought back. So you go to a different land and you're finding all these things. There is a market for them in Britain because there are these auctions. Even just ferns at the time, people who are now moving to the cities to work for factories, who are no longer on the farm, are desperate for nature. There was a huge Victorian fern craze. He could provide all of that as a botanist going to other places. And he knew there was a lot of money to be made doing this. And he was also being paid. He was an agent of the East India Company. So he qualifies very much as a spy. And this is the dress he was wearing. This got me interested because he basically goes in Chinese drag undercover. He shaves his forehead, right? And he wears a braid down his back, the queue. And that was a way that Chinese people signaled they were possessions of the emperor. It is how you make a heterodox society all kind of look the same. You make them wear all the same haircut. He wore that haircut, and despite being quite tall and having a long nose and rounder eyes, had enough of the identifiers that the Chinese weren't looking at him and saying, you don't look like us. You looked like the people who were dressed in mandarin's robes, so it helped him. He went on a junk. Here we have just a basic kind of sailing junk, and he fought pirates. It's not just that his life was in danger from the state because he was breaking all of these laws entering China that didn't want him there. He was in danger from other Chinese. All along the Chinese coast, there was incredible piracy, and it was incredibly dangerous, and he ran into a number of scrapes where he could have lost his life, not just by being caught by the police, but by being caught by pirates. And his stories are great. Among the things that I love about Fortune is he was an adventurer. He's a spy, he's doing a lot of work, but his days were pretty dramatic. He also went by sedan chair. In China, there was still coolie labor, and coolies are a phrase that now is quite derogatory, but they're just sort of represented people who did manual labor. It's like peon, or what we now say is peon in India. And so if you couldn't get a horse, horses are very expensive, they're hard, there was enough manpower in China to use people as transportation. So this is how he went. He went on foot, he went in sedan chair, he went by junk. And he went to different places where tea grows. Tea likes a mountainside. Tea likes a well-drained slope, likes a lot of rain, and so mountains tend to have their own microclimates. He also discovers that Linnaeus, who did most of the classifications for plants, was incorrect when he classified the camellia, the tea camellia. Camellia sinensis is what we now call the Chinese camellia. He said that green tea, black tea, totally different plants. Fortune, who finally goes on the ground to look and see, understands that they are the same plant processed differently, right? They are the boiled potato versus the roast potato, but they don't grow in the same place. When you're bringing out different kinds of qualities in something, you look for different terroir. It's a lot like wine. So he went to the richest green tea areas, and he went to the richest black tea areas, and they were never the same area. And he learned the difference between how they were processed. He learned the secret. Basically, he steals the formula for Coca-Cola. Tea is by far the most popular drink in the world after water, even today. And he unlocks the secret to this. Again, not a pick and eat fruit. So here we have monks in Fujian province picking by hand. It's a lot of labor. If all you can do is just sort of pick the branch of a Christmas tree that has the star on it and nothing else, and then move on, it takes a long time to get a pot of tea. Again, very dependent on coolie labor. You're gonna have to, if you're gonna grow it somewhere, it's not just somewhere that's gonna have the same growing conditions as China to get good, well-drained soil and well-shaded mountains, but you're gonna have to go somewhere where there's an awful lot of low-wage labor or no-wage labor. It is cooked. This is a giant wok. To dry tea out, you either dry it in the sun or you heat it up. And this is a very complicated, that I won't have to walk you through, but I like to show it because it's complicated. You start with fresh tea leaves, and if you go this way, you end up with green tea. I'm sorry, I can't quite see everything because I've got the other windows in the way. And if you go down here, if you wilt it first, if you crush it, if you let it oxidize and sit in its own stew in its own juices, then you roll it, then you dry it. You get all of these tannins. You get the more complex, meaty flavors of a black tea, and then here's everything in between. Fortune learns all of that. He learns about tea making. He's not just going to get a plant out. He's going to get the process itself. And he's going to contribute to science in a pretty substantial way, in a way that we still use today. I mentioned that plants don't travel well on seagoing sailboats. There's salt spray, fresh water is rationed, and plants can't, most of them, the ones that you want, aren't going to be very happy drinking salt water. What Fortune uses, what he discovers, is a way to travel with plants, and that's called the Wardian case. In the Victorian era, they release the taxes on glass. So suddenly you start to get homes with big windows. Up until then, glass was too much of a luxury. The taxes were too high. You had glass, but a lot of the money was being sucked out by the state. After they relieved the glass taxes, you see a lot more industrial production with glass, including the Wardian case. So Charles Bagshaw Ward is a doctor who was, I think, he spent a lot of time of his training in the Caribbean, and he discovers in a glass jar where he has a piece of mold, puts it aside, labels it, there's a seed in this glass jar. He hasn't opened it in years, and the seed sprouts. He has basically invented the terrarium. In a closed glass system, if you have a little bit of sunlight and a little bit of moisture, the plant will aspirate the carbon dioxide, release oxygen, and the liquid, because it can't escape, gets kind of recycled. It's almost like a perpetual motion machine for plants. You don't have to water them if you can keep them encased in glass. The glass is closed and sunlight can get in. This changes the world. Suddenly you can move that cinchona tree to India, the rubber tree to your colony. You can now have these products anywhere you want them. Sugar can go from the Caribbean to the South Pacific. You have just expanded your ability to produce things all over the world. You've created a way for your colonial universe to make money, to solve the problem of colonies paying their way, get the plants out of them, grow them elsewhere. So it works. He figures out a way to get the tea out. He also figures out a way to get tea makers out. He gets tea equipment out, those woks and those ovens. He also figures out that green tea and black tea are different, and that green tea is being colored by the Chinese. They don't know why the West liked their green tea super green, but they did, so they were putting yellow and blue chemicals in it. When this gets discovered in London, the fashion for green tea pretty much is killed forever in Britain. They've never really turned into green tea makers or green tea drinkers. But another reason is that tea takes sugar. Black tea takes sugar. It's more complicated. It's kind of heftier. It also takes milk. Green tea doesn't take either of those. And Britain, with its inability to feed itself, was using tea as a way to get calories in. Sugar calories are pretty dense. They're pretty light. They're easy to ship. Milk is a little bit of protein, and it made people healthier. It boiled the water, so it was curing cholera. Tea drinking places industrialized about 50 years faster than coffee drinking places like Germany, and it's because the water for tea needs to be boiled first, so you've killed the bacteria in it. You can also kill bacteria by fermenting liquids, but if you have a very drunk workforce, if they're all getting their liquid and calories from beer, they're not very useful at a loom or at heavy machinery. So tea was really useful. Within one generation, China is no longer the lead producer of tea. India takes over. The daughter plants of Fortune's Hall will get sent to India successfully after several years, after a lot of failed attempts. And they will be the first plants that get to Darjeeling, which is considered the champagne of tea. There are some native tea varieties to India, basically in Assam province, but they didn't meet the tastes of the British public very well, and it took a long time. They weren't even discovered until the 1830s. So once they realized that there was a kind of native variety of tea in India, they just didn't like it. They realized that you could grow things on the other side of the Himalayas, same mountains, same soil, same basic terroir, and transplant the industry wholesale to a colonial possession that is bleeding money. And the British Empire, for the next 100 years, certainly, controls the tea trade, and so controls all the profits on the tea trade, controls the quality, can keep the poisons out. And they also now have one more product that they can seed in other colonies that they can bring to Kenya and make money there as well, have tea gardens everywhere. So the consequences of moving one little plant and one little drink redound wholesale throughout the empire and throughout the world. It does not, however, save the British East India Company. In 1857, basic governmental mismanagement is going to cause the Indian Rebellion, the mutiny, depending on which side you're on. And that will seal the deal on the fate of the East India Company. After that, Queen Victoria is crowned Empress of India, and then the British government itself becomes the ruler, not the middleman, not the proxy of the East India Company. And here's the world that it changed. Tea, which was already profitable, becomes even more so. It funds and fuels the industrialization and the British Empire all the way through basically until about 1947, forgive me. Through the war to the moment of decolonization, tea was critical to that entire colonial project. Also, incredibly useful, some of the earlier colonies that Britain had in Boston, a bunch of rebels dressed in Indian outfits throw a bunch of tea into Boston Harbor. And that kind of seals the deal on America being a coffee culture. But Britain retained a lot of its early colonies in the Caribbean. And they're good for not a lot of products, but they are good for sugar, right? These are sugar colonies. And if you've been to Britain, their sweets are incredibly sweet. They're almost like hard for an American taste because there's so much sugar. Well, tea gave these other unprofitable colonies, your sugar colonies, somewhere to dump their excess. It really changes the world. And here we have Robert Fortune, an old man. So he made a lot of money, and growing up poor, growing up in a rigid class system and caste system where he didn't have a lot of advancement, going to China changed his life. He died the equivalent of a multimillionaire, and that was because as an agent of the East India Company, he was allowed to use East India Company ships to ship things home. He knew what was valuable. He knew what plants would fetch at auction. He also could bring art and knickknacks back. His eye provided for his family, and from a man who was the son of a farmer, uneducated, he became a solid member of the upper class in Britain. And he stole the formula for Coca-Cola. And with that in mind, I think that I am making my case that this is the most important, greatest act of corporate espionage in the history of the world. And China, ever since, has been mad about it. A lot of people have said to me that they are now taking their revenge on us by stealing our corporate secrets. And there's a lot of truth to that, too. So, thank you very much for joining me and for putting up with my technological glitches. I would love to open up the floor to questions, but I'm going to have Lauren manage that for me because I don't know what to do.
Sure thing. Well, thank you so much. That was a fabulous talk. I can't wait to read the book. Okay, so questions. There are a couple ways we can do this. You can unmute yourself, or you can use your chat function on your I think it's the bottom, sometimes it's the top. It says mute, stop video, security participants chat. If you open the chat box, you can write a question in and I'll read it if you'd like. Oh, somebody's unmuted themselves. Go ahead.
Oh, I unmuted
yes.
myself because I thought just, well, I had two questions actually. Okay. One, do we know what route Fortune took, how the heck he got out of China? Because that's a pretty major those are big distances, especially if you're being carried by sedan chair. Mm-hmm. And then my other question was, when you were researching this, looking into all this, did you come across it all? And I don't know how what the time factor was, but I know there was a lot of competition going on in Europe, probably simultaneously, to try to figure out how the Chinese made porcelain, which was the huge export from China at the time.
Yeah, so indeed, that is, it's in my book. The important thing about the relationship between the porcelain trade and the tea trade is that porcelain at the moment was collectible and desirable in part because of the fetishization of China. It was mostly ballast. If you are exporting silk or you are exporting tea, it's very, very light. And it's very hard to balance a sailing ship against the winds without something in the hold to sort of carry it down. You don't want to be too light in the water. So they sent porcelain back and forth to Europe mostly as a way of counterbalance to these incredibly light commodities of tea and silk. In the book, and you're going to forgive me because I can't remember the year at this point, I do talk about the moment that in Britain they discover how to get the silica to be as hard and as fine as porcelain in China. And it is part of the Industrial Revolution too. But that was a very late development in the tea trade.
And do you know how he got, what route he took? Or
I do. If I had, I don't think the map of China, let me, if I scroll back some, let's see if it'll let me scroll back. In the green tea and black tea areas, he went mostly by water.
Oh, he did, because I was thinking it was over land. Okay.
Well, by land too, but there was, the Yangtze is a huge highway through China, right? Divides north and south. There was also the Yellow River, which was a man-made canal that at the time, it's no longer passable, was, forgive me for scrolling through this, see if I can help find a visual that gets us to where we're going. But the Yellow River was another way that this man-made canal, the bulk of goods in China traveled via water. So here we have the Yangtze. It reaches the entire length of the country. And somewhere in here is the Yellow River. Importantly, while China is very, very big, he's not actually covering a lot of ground. He's here in the Yangtze, and he's sort of down here along the coast to Fujian province. He doesn't need to go very deep in because this is where most of the tea production was at the time. But he's covering, if you're on foot, it's a lot, it takes a lot of time. It took 3 years. And he would leave after the Second Opium War. You now have a treaty port in Shanghai. You have a treaty port in Fujian. You didn't have those before. Up until the First Opium War, this is the only way in or out, Canton. It had city walls 20 feet thick and 40 feet high. It was, no one got into China from the port of Canton. It was only after the First Opium War that you could even land a Western ship on the coast at all. And they also got the port of Hong Kong, which they, up until very recently, still had. So he went primarily via water and on foot, in and out. He would leave, this is Shanghai around here. He left by ship out of Shanghai and went around, here we go. He would leave, travel through here, through the straits, then down, and I think he went in to Calcutta on this side of India, right down here. And from there, his coolie labor, as well as water and oxen, moved the Wardian cases up into the Himalayas, which are right in here. And you can see, so this is China right over here, and this is India right in here. It's the mountains that divide them. They're really on just opposite sides of each other that the tea is growing. They were bringing tea to a mirror image in the very same geological, there we go.
I guess I was confused because when you had mentioned the Himalayas before, I wasn't picturing him over in Fujian province and going by water. I was picturing having to cross the entire country to get to the Himalayas to get.
No, he put them on East India Company ships that that went by water this way. And that was about a trip of a month, but it was long enough that the tea seeds still couldn't survive. And then once you got to India, it was another several weeks up into the mountains.
And what was the reaction when the Chinese caught on to what had happened?
It was too late. By the time they caught on, they couldn't do anything about it. The secret was gone. The farms had been started. The genie was out of the bottle.
And we were drugging them. I mean, the British were drugging.
We were sending battleships, or the British were sending battleships. They call it gunboat diplomacy. China had sailing junks and a few cannons. We had steam, the West that is, had steamships and proper guns, and it was no match whatsoever. And they were forced to sign unequal treaties at the end of a rifle. And they're still mad about that too.
I was gonna say, no wonder. Yeah.
Other questions?
Yes, we have a couple in the chat if I can. I'll read the first one from Joan. What relation does the East India Company that you're talking about have to our port of Salem? Is there a relation that you're aware of?
I don't know enough.
Well, I'm wondering actually, if you don't mind, there's a lot of East India, the East India Hall, the East India Marine Society, and I'm wondering if it is more to do with the number of captains and seafarers that were going to the East India Company, but not necessarily with the British East India, going to the East Indies, but not with the British East India.
Oh, no, I mean, early on, the East India Company, the Joint Stock Company, was the sort of colonial arm of the British Empire. So I do think that like some of the original East India Company ships and ports would have been managed by these, I mean, which is why, as I said, Eli Yale, right? He was the East India Company manager, and here he was in Connecticut. So.
Great. Okay, great. And then Brian asks, how long does it take to regrow those top 2 leaves? And then he also asked, is India and China the big players today, or has it spread out some more?
Well, it's certainly spread out, but if you want wonderful tea, if you want the best tea, it's a little bit like saying I want French wine or Italian wine instead of I want Oregon wine. Lots of people like Oregon wine, but I want French wine or Italian wine. So, you know, you can now have it everywhere. The tea grows anywhere you've got the right climate. It's got to be sort of hot. It's got to be well drained. It mists. It burns in direct sunlight. But if you've got so there are even some, actually Robert Fortune was hired again by the US government in the 1860s to try and start tea gardens in what was then, what was the South, in South Carolina and below, because they thought this would be a good competing crop to cotton. It requires very low wage labor, and almost immediately afterwards, the Civil War in America starts, and Fortune will spend a very long time arguing with the US Department of Agriculture for his money back after he shipped all these tea seeds to the US right before the Civil War.
That's an interesting timing, huh? Oh,
yeah.
Things may have been different here. And how long, once you pick those 2 top leaves, how long does it take to regrow?
So the plant will start regenerating almost immediately. Those, you know, it really wants to grow. That's what plants do. That's kind of its mission. The more it can grow, the more seeds it can put out, the better its genes' survival chance, and it needs to provide itself with energy. So if you take those away, it's a little bit like pruning back any kind of garden plant. It starts almost immediately to give you new shoots.
That's just neat. So is there any place in the United States where tea is grown?
So there are a few. Again, I don't think they're very good, but they're kind of show garden tea, novelty tea. I think maybe Lipton or one of the big, you know, Twinings has a tea garden in South Carolina, one of the original ones. I think there's also somewhere along the sort of East Coast, the kind of Mediterranean climate of New England. They tried to get something growing there, and they pick a little bit about it. But again, anywhere you've got a minimum wage, tea is almost not worth the effort. It's too expensive. And machine picked tea is just not that good. You get too much twig, too much shake in it. And it really requires a low wage economy. It really requires slave labor, which we didn't have almost immediately after tea arrived here.
So even South America and Central America, you don't see it either.
You know, I don't know much about South and Central America by way of tea, to be very honest. I know there's like a really great kind of East African tea that people are really fond of. I know that it grows places like Turkey is really, but I don't know anything about South America.
It's a great question here from Katie. Who owned the tea gardens in India? The East India Company directly, the British government, and whoever did they in essence enslave the Indian tea workers?
So that's a very good question. So at first they were all company gardens, which is to say they were all owned by the East India Company. Once the East India Company folds after the Indian Mutiny, they all were down to the government of India, but also farmers who were able to purchase land, colonial farmers, they would start gardens there, and they would have get the profits from that too. Were people enslaved? They were paid very, very, very little. They were on contracts. We actually have some of the contracts in the British Library that the Indian peons were indentured to, or and certainly the Chinese were basically enslaved to. We've heard the phrase Shanghai, right, to Shanghai somebody. That comes from the moment where Fortune is traveling, where there was a real problem of people stealing people off the coast and shipping them, say, to California to build a railroad or to Australia to work in a gold mine. And that's how we get the phrase Shanghai. The Chinese laborers who went to India for fortune were pretty mad about it. And there were a couple of mutinies there as well.
So nowadays, the biggest grower of tea and seller of tea is still China and maybe India runner up.
Yeah, China is definitely rebounded. Mostly it's an internal market there because they are also fantastic tea drinkers and they're 1.3 billion people. So they could just sell to themselves for the rest of time and still be the largest tea market.
And then India would be like the second largest. Okay.
Any other questions? Feel free to unmute yourself.
And there's teas that are worth far more than gold by weight, which I find very interesting. It's one of the rare things. It's such a lightweight commodity that you can have an ounce of tea that is worth more than an ounce of gold if it's from the right region and picked in the right way and sold at auction. So,
wow.
But an ounce of tea is a lot.
This is fabulous.
I was wondering, if he didn't speak Chinese, where did he get his interpreters from? And was that dangerous for the Chinese interpreter? Because
very dangerous for the Chinese interpreter. And very good question. So let's see, was it this way that we got the Chinese map? Let's see.
There it is.
So most of his interpreters would have come from the Treaty Port of Canton, which is where most of the tea trade existed up until the first Opium War. And because this is where all of the tea trade is going on, there are interpreters there. There are people whose job it is to negotiate between the sellers of China and the buyers of the West. And they speak a little bit of a kind of pidgin English, some of which, again, we have today. So the word like chop chop, that comes from this pidgin Chinese trade language from the tea trade. Once the Opium War, the first Opium War, and you get these 4 extra treaty ports plus Hong Kong, he could then hire people on the coast in the treaty ports there. Again, you weren't allowed in or out beyond the treaty port. You were just there to trade. But the people who were doing that middleman work between China and the Brits, they picked up a little of English. They could speak a little bit of whatever regional dialect they were in, and he hired them as his interpreters for the different regions. And it was very dangerous for them. Were they ever caught, they all would have been killed. Other questions?
Anything
I can't
else?
see the, so.
Doesn't appear to be any more questions. Well, I want to thank you so much. This was fabulous. And I hope everybody goes out and buys the book and gives it to their friends, because this is such a great story and you tell it really well. So thank you so much for joining us.
And I really appreciate you guys launching this. As I said, it's a brave new world, and I feel very, very flattered that you thought of me and that worked out as well as it did.
Thank you very
Absolutely.
much. It was very interesting.
Yes, thank you so much. And thank you all for joining us. I hope we'll see you again on July 9th for the President's War Talk.
Thank you.
Have a great night,
you.
everybody. Thank you so much,
Okay.
Sarah.
So much.
Thank you.
Take
Take
care.
care.
Well,
Thank you, everybody.